Okay. Good evening. So last week we started talking Hashat Shmot, Sefer Shmot. We spoke about names. Then I left you all in suspense because I wasn't here for a few days. And I got a panicked message from somebody earlier, the end of last week, that said, "Rabbi, do I need to change my name?" So I hope he's listening to this because I didn't give him an answer yet. But we started speaking about whether the Poskim discuss what having a non-Jewish name. The Maram Shik, who was we explained last time, went so far as to say that it could be, the Midrash says, one of the reasons why Bnei Israel was zochet to come out of Egypt was because they didn't change their name. There's the Maram Shik, I think he says it's an Issur D'Oraita to have a non-Jewish name, and we discussed his proofs, etc. And that was where we ended it, hence the panic message. But so I want to look at another side of this tonight, which is Rav Moshe Feinstein discusses this in a couple of places as well. First of all, the Maram Shik, one of his proofs for the fact to say that you shouldn't have, or you aren't allowed to have a non-Jewish name, was from a Tosfot related to Gittin. But the truth is that there's a Gemara in Gittin itself, where the Gemara says, it's on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Bet, the Gemara says, Gittin abayim midinat hayam, v'edim chatumim aleim, af al pi sheshmoteim keshemot avodei kochavim, ksherim. You have a get which comes from overseas, outside of Israel, and the witnesses are signed, and they have non-Jewish names on the get, and it says that is kosher. Says the Gemara, because in Chutz La'aretz, that's the names everybody has. Everybody has these non-Jewish names to begin with. So that Gemara is a big kasha on what the Maram Shik is saying. And let me share with you what are some of the insights of Rav Moshe Feinstein on this. We mentioned very much the environment and the society in which the poskim were living in, and that contributes to the factors in terms of the question that's being asked and the answer that's going to be given. So Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva where really he's asked about naming a child. Parents want to name a baby after their grandparents or great-grandparents, and the person who asked the question says, well, our grandparents, parents, I'm not sure, who we want to name the baby after, but their name is not a Jewish name, it's a name in Yiddish or whatever it is. This wasn't a Jewish name in the first place. Is it appropriate? Is it the proper thing to keep going with these names? So we find a theme which we find in many places in Igrot Moshe. Moshe Feinstein defends the practice of our ancestors. It's not that we suddenly got better than them. They knew what they were doing. And so he says like this, I'll read it to you. He says, first thing he says, to have a non-Jewish name and a foreign language, not the best thing, but it's not an issur. Okay, it's not forbidden. He says, mentioned this last time as well. You go back in our history, you find that many upstanding individuals throughout the generations had non-Jewish names. Even we mentioned there's some in the Mishnah and the Gemara. We look at the names of the Rishonim, the Achronim. So he says we have lots of names which are in from Ashkenaz, names in the language of Ashkenaz, and Sfarad, names of Sfarad. He says, Gam Gonei Rav, Migdolei Rishonim, Kabbalah Magid Mishnah. Right, the Magid Mishnah, one of the commentaries on the Rambam, his name was Vidal, which is not a Hebrew name, not a Jewish name. He says, V'gam Shem Maimon, Aviv Shel Rambam. Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, right? He says, who says Maimon? Where does that name come from? Maybe that wasn't doesn't come as a Jewish name. He says, Kanireh Shu Shem La'az, is a foreign name, seems to be. Shelachen Chas V'Chalila Lanu Lomar. Shelo Asu K'Ogen. We're not going to attack the father of the ancestors of the Rambam gave a name that was forbidden. And the אחרי שכבר נתרגלו ישראל באלו השמות, אין בזה שייכות לטעם הגנאי. The thing is, these names, there are names which came maybe from outside, but once they became Jewish names, now it's considered a Jewish name. It goes down the generations. That's fine. That's acceptable. That's not considered a non-Jewish name anymore. That's it in that sense. And he says, regarding your question, perpetuating the name in the family, even though it's not a Hebrew name, He says, הזקנים והזקנות שנקראו בשמות לעז, שהוא עניין כבוד המשפחה, the honor of the family, to keep the name, אף שהם מהדור הקודם, שעל כל פנים היא עליו לכבדם, this is part of honoring them by keeping the name. וכל שכן כשיש עליו לקרוא השם הוריו ממש, but more so if you're naming after one's parents, שכב בכבודם, וגם בדברי חז"ל במדרשים איתה שקוראים עכשיו הבנים והבנות על שם דורות הקודמים. So he says there is certainly great merit to this practice of naming after one's ancestors, and even though it's not a Hebrew name, but once the name is become accepted and it's become part of, that's a Jewish name. But in terms of the broader question, how did these names come in the first place? And we saw the Midrash says that Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim could only one of the things that kept them going, that they didn't change their names. So there they didn't change their name, but afterwards, now we say the Maram Shik even said it. So all right, how can it be? So this is his answer. He says again, Rav Moshe, הנה יש מקום לומר, זה ששיבחו חז"ל בגלות מצרים שלא שינו את שמות. He says the fact that they praise, Bnei Israel praised for not changing their names in that time. He says that was at a time who קודם מתן Torah. This is the main difference. This was before Har Sinai. This was before we had the Tarag Mitzvot. And therefore, he says, Lo haya aker gadol b'shvil kiyum hamitzvot b'nei Noach. How are you going to keep your identity? How are you going to keep what sets aside the Jewish people? He says, what? They didn't have the Torah yet. So one of the things, there was greater significance to the fact that they had distinct names. He says more, the more so, בפרט שחלק גדול מישראל עבדו גם כן עבודה זרה. At that time, many of them were performing idolatry. ורובן לא מלאו את פניהן עד סמוך לגאולה כשהיו צריכים לאכול הפסח שמל נתן יהושע. Not only that, we find in the Midrashim, they weren't performing Brit Milah, and it was only just before the Korban Pesach, they did Brit Milah. He says other mitzvot and things which they weren't keeping, there's all the more significance to keeping these other factors, having distinct Jewish names. And then he says, שלכן, בשביל האמונה שגלו ורצו שיהיו ניכרים שם ישראל, הנהיגו להקפיד שלא ישנו את שמם. He says, it's not just a technical thing, it's not just semantic. Part of, you look at the name, you look at the meanings of the name, I can talk about it. There's a part of keeping these Jewish names and these Hebrew names that was the way of having faith in the Geulah, having their emunah, passing it on to the next generation. It wasn't just something which was keeping them distinct, but that was a form of showing their emunah that they were going to be redeemed. And therefore, because they had this emunah in the Geulah, Ratzu sheyu nikarim Shem Yisrael, hinhigu lakpid. Therefore, they were very strict on this. They were very exacting. Shelo yishanu et shmam, v'lo yishanu et leshonam. They wouldn't change their names. They wouldn't change their language. And that's why it's related to the Geulah. It's not just a technical thing, but it's part of their wanting and believing in and waiting for the Geulah to take place. And so that was in Mitzrayim, and that was before Matan Torah. He said, "Aval la'achar Matan Torah, after Matan Torah, אין לנו חיוב מדינה." There's no obligation in the formal sense. וגם לא מענייני זהירות ומוסר, אלא מה שנצטווינו התרי"ג מצוות לדור. Now we have the mitzvot. There's no one of the Targum mitzvot that says don't have an English name, right? And like the Maram Shek who understood it wanted to say that. So that's the difference. So if the person who asked me the question is watching, it's okay. You don't have to change your name. But I won't tell you what his name is. But the point is what you see from here again. Rav Moshe Feinstein agrees with the Maram Shek in the sense that better to have a Jewish name, it's better to have that as part of the identity. But you see that the Maram Shek is one posek who's living in one generation, a certain place, who says, Isur Doraita, no less. So Moshe Feinstein says, it's something, you can do it, but it's not, it justifies the practice. Obviously, you have to look at the broader context, and you have to look at why people had non-Jewish names and what the name represented. The Maram Shek was living at a time of assimilation, a time of the Enlightenment, a time when many of those who came and who had it wasn't just a name out of convenience from Moshe Feinstein's day. And in our day, somebody is born in America, and England, South Africa, Australia, wherever it is, you have a name. So you have your Jewish name that you give at the bris, and you have the English name, because everybody speaks English. They're not doing it to try and throw away their Jewish identity. They're doing it because they don't want to have a strange name, because they're doing it out of convenience, out of purposes like that. In the times of Okay. In the time of the Maharam Sheikh, a lot of the people were changing their names. There was a statement. It was saying, I don't want to, they would have a name that is a non-Jewish name in order to try and throw away their identity, in order to reject their Jewish identity. That is the purpose of having that name, and that's the meaning of that name. And of course, everybody would agree that that is forbidden. It's not something one should do. But there we have it, and that's the Akma. I'll just say one thing: in terms of the Midrash as well, that says they were redeemed because they didn't change their name, their dress, and their language, all those things. So there are those who understand it's not just one of those things, but it's all of those things together. It's if you reject all of that, and then you reject your identity, so that's something else. And it was in the merit of keeping all those things. If it happens in a society, different name for convenience, different dress for convenience, that is something that doesn't necessarily fall into that same category. Rabbi Hanania ben Akash Omer,